And then again, he's also suggested a federal writers program. Books that were published through state guides had some references too. Again, I've looked at different versions of both New Mexico and Texas, and I've not found anything that leaps right out at me. So some interesting clues about Lue locations. Carl very much emphasized this idea of a 105-degree, 12.5-minute longitudinal parallel. It's just a line that cuts straight down. It starts in Salida, Colorado, and goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean in Mexico. And many of these alleged Lue caches have been found relative to that line, within 5 or 10 miles of either direction. Again, he talks about the presence of monuments, and there's rock carvings. I showed you guys a picture earlier of a particular monument. He referred to at one point when the Lue chase was really on that it wasn't uncommon for people that were looking for it to destroy the monuments to prevent other people from finding them, or sometimes moving them. The way he would talk about this in the early 70s, that there was a lot of people in Colorado looking for this particular treasure, and they were willing to do a lot of things to improve their likelihood of beating them. He specifically mentions the Rio Grande Pyramid as a potential marker, which again would be consistent with the picture of the pyramid. This was probably the most obscure clue, and this is going to come back up again later, and it's going to really be interesting when it does. He talked about a specific article in the National Geographic about the mystery of the medicine wheels, and it was very strange. He hadn't mentioned the Lue in the National Prospector Gazette in 3 or 4 years, and then just this one little blurb. Lue enthusiasts might do well to check out this article. He talked about people using the, again, we're talking about the 60s, so I don't know what the computing power was back then, but there were people that were trying to crack the Lue, and then this idea that there were multiple caches and that people were interpreting various parts of the map to suggest how many different caches it might actually lead to, with no real consensus, except that the idea that in all likelihood the Lue leads to more than one cache. So we talked about rock panels and monuments. He published this one in Treasure of the Valley of Secrets. Again, we got a sketch of a panel, but we don't have a picture, which I think would be really interesting. And obviously, this is in La Cueva, which is farther north. It's up where a lot of the alleged Lue caches have been found. And again, it's sort of a backwards version with not quite as much detail, and then kind of upside down as well. We still see the arrowhead, the slotted pyramid, the sine wave, and the sun there. He had another sketch in that book. Again, we see some of the similarities. He talks about broadly where it was found. This was found up in Colorado, closer to where he lived. By this point, Carl was actually living in a small town called Segundo, which was north of Raton, New Mexico. He had ostensibly moved there to seek a treasure, not the Lue, oddly enough. There was a second treasure that he was working on recovering that was in the same area. But when he published Treasure of the Valley of Secrets, that book was largely about the treasure he was seeking, but he makes these veiled and repeated references to the Lue in it. It's very strange. He keeps kind of fitting it in there, even though that's not what he's talking about. But it's actually probably the single best source of information from Carl directly about the Lue. And again, we can see we've got the triangle, we've got what's the crossbars, we've got the steps there. He refers to this kind of drawing several times in the book as well. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be some land navigation, river, or mountain chain. This is something that he posted about the actual Treasure of the Valley of Secrets, which, as I understand it, was a treasure that he believed was in the Purgatory River. Now, he mentions Lue number 1, which I thought was interesting, because it's kind of the first time that he suggests that there, I mean, if there's a Lue number 1, the natural assumption is there must at least be a Lue number 2. Otherwise, there would be no reason to delineate that. So I thought that was kind of interesting. This is going to come back up again, too, later when he has beef. He's talking about a treasure hunter that was watching them and had kind of a perch. And he's kind of pointing to where that perch is. My suspicion is that he's actually talking about Tom Hilton, who will later write the scathing review of the treasure. he lived in Cimarron, which was not all that far from Segundo, probably not more than 3 hours away, and was known to come up and visit with Carl pretty frequently and Carl's friends and try to get information about the Lue before he wrote his story. So there's that monument again. Ed Lefkowitz was also one of Carl's regular partners. I don't know that I've ever associated him with the Lue, though, the way I did that on the and that is the actual Rio Grande Pyramid. And again, he does not necessarily affiliate that with the Lue specifically, but at one point he makes a point to put in a small snippet in one of his articles that people frequently use this as a treasure marker because it was pretty prominent. The Rio Grande Pyramid also has, I'm not sure, I'll come back to that. So to the right of the pyramid is also a long, flat mountain range with a notch, big notch out of it. So between the notch and the pyramid, you had two pretty significant geographical markers that somebody would triangulate with. So this is the blessed mill we're talking about. I don't know if you guys are familiar. This is actually in Wyoming. And again, it got me kind of wondering why did he sort of subtly refer to this map, or excuse me, the medicine mill, but not really offer any ideas why we should care or why researchers should be interested. But you're going to see why here in just a bit. Tom Hilton, when he wrote his piece, wrote a waybill. He claimed he had solved the map and published this in Lue Treasure. Now, what was interesting is it's very, looks pretty solid. He's got latitude and longitude. He's got all these markings and things that look consistent with the Lue. But what he didn't do was tell anybody how he came to that. He literally says, I sat down with a map and I started drawing lines, and lo and behold, this comes up. So he has a perfect opportunity to really discredit the Lue by saying, here's how I figured it out. He miffs it. He just publishes this story, which is really a story about him going out to the field multiple times, not finding the treasure, and really being sour about it. And so it's kind of interesting. Again, he had this really unique opportunity to blow the lid right off this. And I don't know how many of you guys read treasure magazines. I've got a couple thousand, and I can probably count on one hand how many times they published a story that said this treasure is fake. Their bread and butter is publishing stories and not telling you whether they're fake or true. And for them to publish a story that unequivocally says this is fake, and you've all been duped, was pretty shocking. Kind of an interesting side note, you can see where one of those lines goes right through Segundo, which is where Carl lived. Carl briefly references a situation where he had trouble with tourists for a while because they had been led to the conclusion that Lue actually stood for Look Under Exonimo, which was the name of his store. And so he had people believing that he had buried the treasure in his own parking lot. So yeah, this is really interesting. He's got the pyramid. He's actually associated that with the Rio Grande Pyramid. Again, we see some of Cimarron was where Hilton lived. This treasure site is actually what we would call the Black Lake site, which is not far from a town called Eagle's Nest. And again, it's the very first one that people associate with the recovery. Rumors got around that Carl had made a recovery at Black Lake. Other people started going to Black Lake and supposedly had made recoveries of their own until it was exhausted, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of a map I had put together. That red line indicates that longitudinal line that I indicated earlier. And Eagle's Nest is also the Black Lake site, so you can see how close that was. La Cueva was where one of those rock drawings was done, so we can see that was also pretty close. We see that the Rio Grande Pyramid as a marker is actually pretty far from that. And then again, Carl does not live very far from it. Carl had indicated at some point that Salida was also a recovery site. There's a place there called Francisco Peak and Francisco Pass, and that they had made a recovery there. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Treasure Mountain near Pagosa Springs. That's associated with a treasure called the Treasure Mountain treasure. that was about 300 Frenchmen who supposedly had been commissioned by France, the leader of France, and they came over here specifically when France still controlled the territory to do a huge mining operation, were subsequently killed. It's a very well-known story in that area, and interestingly enough, we see a lot of the same features. We see things like they had this mine, they had multiple cache sites, because what they would do is rather than take all the gold and silver they were mining back to the port, they would leave it where they found it, with the idea that in the winter when they wanted to go south to Taos, they would just pick it all up where they went. So there were multiple cache sites. They also used tree blazes and monuments and rock art. You see all that in the earlier versions of the Treasure Mountain story, which is my way of saying there are a lot of similarities between those two stories. The idea was that they were going down to Taos, which would have been just off the edge of the bottom of the map. This is another version of that same. Oh, I thought I had two there. So again, I mentioned recovery sites. Again, the biggest one was probably Black Lake, which is referenced several times. Interestingly, he published a letter in the National Prospector Gazette from a woman named Mary Carson Phillips. I have not seen her name referenced anywhere else in any of his works or any outside of those works. If I take the letter at face value, it was very revealing. She mentions names of people who made recovery. She talks about where they recovered them. She talks about what they did with their money that they found. It was very, very revealing. But she talks specifically about Francisco Peak, Elizabethtown, which is actually fairly close to Black Lake, Mora, which is also fairly close to Black Lake, Romeroville, which is farther south, I believe, and then she mentions again somewhere north of Salina. Carl von Mueller in '81, in reference to, I can't remember if that was the article, Boyd Jolly, who was from American Fork, had written a piece about him, and he wrote him back, and Boyd subsequently published parts of that letter. And Carl, again, he reiterated that Black Lake and Mora were both cache sites that had been worked. Francisco Peak had been worked, and then much farther south than Carolina. Boyd Jolly also talks again specifically that Black Lake and Mora had been cleaned out. This was in 1981, and Carl had initially allegedly made his recovery in '58. So we're talking, he mentions 56 and 57 there, but he also says 3 carloads. Interesting. So also, Michael Paul Henson had a letter from Carl that he published, and he also mentions the San Luis Valley, which might be the same cache site as the Francisco one, and then a ghost town in the middle. I think I mentioned it earlier. Well, it was posted earlier, but I didn't mention it. Carl had dropped a clue that the Lue is not associated with any current town. And so what we find is a lot of these towns are basically ghost towns at this point. Some of them have a small population, but I think that was a clue, but it was kind of a sleight of hand on his part. No current town would suggest that maybe an older town that was no longer inhabited. And those all seem to fit that premise. Again, Carl makes some more references to the idea that there were other caches that there may have been as 10 more, and those were as far south as Mexico. The idea being that, of course, they'll follow a parallel line, that it goes all the way to the ocean, and then presumably you can see the cache recoveries. He mentions New Mexico and Mexico specifically for a second. This is another map I put together. Again, you get those are all alleged recovery sites. You can see how close they are to that line. Although with a map on scale that size, those distances could be 40 or 50 miles. But it's still pretty intriguing. You just follow this one line, and for whatever reason, you're following. So we talked a little bit about the actual symbology of the map. I kind of took a little time to break it down and look at individual parts of the map. These 2 bars always kind of puzzle me. They don't seem to fit with much. What I've come to the conclusion of is that those might suggest some way of measuring the stars or celestial navigation. So you think about the way those 2 bars look, particularly the parallel one or the upright bar. There's kind of a space in there. It almost looks like that other bar would fit in there, and then you could slide it up and down. And true enough, when you start looking at ways people do celestial navigation, it's precisely the kind of device you would use to use the stars to pinpoint your location. Although interestingly, it doesn't necessarily tell you what stars to look for or what settings you would have. But again, I thought that the similarities are pretty striking. And I think we got another version where we're actually seeing those bars in use and how they could be used to triangulate stars with the horizon of the point. So there may be a clue there to how to read parts of the map. We've got these ideas of there's two specific sine waves. We've got the one that cuts through the middle. This one is interesting because I've often wondered if this tail here is supposed to be a part of that map or if it's just kind of an artifact. Anybody study astronomy at all? Really? If you're going to see an interesting, and again, we've already talked about celestial navigation. What happens when you look at a star chart? A big fat sine wave running right through the middle of it, just like the map. I'm not an astronomer, unfortunately, so I can only speculate. But the similarities seem pretty incontrovertible. So some other points of interest. There's two lines in the map, or three lines, excuse me, that appear to disconnect and then reconnect. I've added those red lines to sort of highlight that. Those two are interesting because they're kind of fed into the sun rays. The other piece about the sun rays is you've got those breaks in there. So I'm not sure, again, those breaks are there's no familiarity, there's no consistency to where those breaks are. So I don't know if that's some kind of code or if there's something that's supposed to fill those breaks. But these other two lines, while they rest within the sun rays, they clearly are not meant to be a part of the sun. So when we apply the sun, what does that start to look like, you guys think? I had a picture of it up earlier. What's that? Do you guys remember when I had the medicine wheel? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It looks like it goes like we cut half the medicine wheel and we got these waves coming up. And also, if you turn the Lue sideways, we're going to get that kind of a breakdown. And then it becomes, is there a way to line those specific sunbeams up with natural features, specific mountain peaks, something like Colbert Peak or White Peak? There's a lot of different mountains in that area. Francisco Peak, the Rio Grande Pyramid. So there is some idea that maybe we can orient if we know which peak to use and knew how far to turn the sun rays to come up with some overlays that would kind of point us in the right direction. This is another one I did where, again, we see how some of those beams are coming awful close to the ledge cache recovery. So it would be pretty interesting to follow that parallel where some of those lines cross and see what might be there. I'm not sure if anybody's done that. I just kind of threw that together myself using pyramids. Pyramids where the lines are coming out of that. Okay. I oriented it there. It's possible it could be oriented somewhere else. It's also possible that it's not what it was intended for at all. It just seemed like a pretty intriguing possibility to me. So where does the Lue come from? That's always a good question. And I don't have an answer for that. There are a lot of pretty good theories, and I'll tell you a really good non-theory. Carl himself said it's not Mayan and not Incan. He did suggest that it may be a church treasure. And if we're talking church, where's our overlap in terms of other cultures? Are we talking about the Jesuits from the French? Are we talking about Jesuits from the Spanish? Are we talking Franciscan? It's possible it's not a single source, even though we usually think of the church as kind of independent of those other bodies. He mentions that tomb of the missing padre several times, which, again, he had sort of attributed to the meaning of the initials of the Lue, which wasn't consistent with what was kind of picked out there with the words individually. But again, it's another reference to this idea that the church had some involvement in this treasure. The Cave of Gold is actually not the Lue, but it appears in that Treasure of the Valley of Secrets, where he suggested that the Cave of Gold they found had an Aztec ceremonial cave in it. Again, he talks here again, it may be Spanish or Aztec, or that it may be a church treasure. Some believe it's French. So we really don't know. There is one popular theory, and if you've done any research on the Lue on the internet, I will tell you there are a lot of things that I'm not certain about the Lue, but one thing I'm extremely certain about. There is a prevalent theory that the Lue is a Nazi treasure. I absolutely 100% do not believe it is a Nazi treasure. And I can tell you where that story started. And I think it's important because, again, to me it's really important to say these are some things people have suggested to draw your own conclusions. Don't get misled with the Nazi stuff. It's really good. So we have a lot of possibilities. My suspicion is that it is either Spanish, French, or KGC. I don't think KGC made it there. Carl never actually talked about the KGC. That would have been a topic that came up when the first edition of the Black Book was published. But I'm not sure how well that was received at the time. It wasn't until Bob Brewer started talking a lot more in the early 90s on TreasureNet about the KGC that it really gained a lot of momentum. But we're going to talk about why that may be a pretty big candidate in this minute. So again, a Masonic treasure, right? I kind of alluded to the idea that there is a lot of Masonic imagery. We see a sun, we see a pyramid, we see an all-seeing eye, we see the column, we see what looks to me to be a plum. So there's a number of different things in there that suggest that symbolism is present in the map. Probably the biggest concern that I have is that those symbolisms are not unique to Masons. We see that symbolism with the KGC, we see it with the Templars, we also see it with pirates. So this is a Masonic panel, and I've outlined again, we're seeing those very specific things again. We've got the columns, we've got the stairs, we've got the sun. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there is a lot of again, that's just one Masonic panel, but we see a lot of similarities. There's the eye, the triangle, which goes to the pyramid. I mentioned pirates. I don't know if people associate pirates with the Masons, but if you look at enough pirate flags, the symbology is remarkably similar. They're using harps, they're using skulls, they're using daggers, they're using swords and bones and hourglasses. It's interesting. Again, my suspicion is that a lot of these are reinventions of the same organizations over time. They're maintaining the symbols, but they're changing their own name. And I think that goes as far back as the Templars. So, I wanted to compare the Lue to other maps. This is actually a Jesuit map known as the Molina map. And I think of all the maps I've looked at, this is the one that probably has the most similarities with the Lue. Again, the Lue does not look like a map. This does. But what I like about this map is that it's very clean, it's very tight, it looks like somebody sat down and drafted it. It's unusual. This is part of allegedly part of a treasure in southern Arizona, as I recall. It's a well-known treasure. Probably the biggest discrepancy between this and the Lue is that there's a lot of English and a lot of some numbers here too, right? The Lue does not reveal any of that kind of thing. Compare this to some KGC symbolism. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with the KGC. The KGCs look very disorganized. Now, I'm assuming that's part of the coding of the messaging. But they also have lots of numbers and letters backwards and just different things to kind of fare through. Whereas again, the Lue is a lot of symbols, but nothing that's real relatable. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. This is an actual, as I understand it, a KGC panel that's actually in Utah. Now, I wish I had my little laser pointer pulling up the cat, but we see some of the same symbolism. There's a sun there. We see there's a compass. I feel like there's some other stuff there. I probably should have done a better job highlighting that. There is, there's a pyramid. There is a ladder that can also be a column very easily. But part of what you see is, again, this is a very well recognized KGC panel, but it's very, does not look like there was a lot of time or attention into putting in like placement of the symbols. It just looks scattered, like somebody just threw a handful of stickers on the wall or whatever. But again, we're seeing the same kind of symbolism, so it does suggest that there may be some good connection. Are you guys familiar with this panel? I feel like it's Utah Lake, maybe. So this is the wolf map. This is also a KGC map. So this is kind of that other one was a rock panel. This is an actual map that somebody drew out. And again, we see this kind of, it's kind of a combination between the last two. We got some elements similarly where we got very distinct lines that have been drawn. But we also have these random letters and numbers and pictures. So again, the Lue stands alone in terms of just being really peculiar because nothing else looks like it. There's nothing to compare it against that's comparable. So I mentioned earlier about the multiple cache sites on a single Lue cache site. So this is a KGC overlay. The idea being that if you could locate the general area where a KGC treasure was supposed to be, you could align your overlay with a map and figure out where individual caches were, where each one of those little dots would be a small cache. Again, there's a measure of protectivity there. Number one, it's a lot easier to draw 20 small holes than it is to draw one really deep, really big one to hide one thing. And then again, there's this idea that if somebody finds one, if they aren't clued into the idea that there's a template or that there's a master strategy and pattern to the placement, then they would very easily overlook